I am Kendra, 35 years old, and after dedicating 8 years of my life to nursing my father through his severe stroke recovery, he looked me dead in the eye and left his entire estate to my golden child sister. She had only bothered to show up 10 weeks ago, when the doctor said his health was finally stabilizing. I did not scream or cry or beg for what was rightfully mine. I simply handed over my medical power of attorney, placed the heavy brass house keys on his expensive mahogany dining table, and offered a calm, unbothered smile. Congratulations, I told them. But when my father read the formal letter attached to those keys, he completely lost his mind. "You cannot be serious," he shouted, his face turning an alarming shade of purple as his hands shook. He had absolutely no idea the trap he had just sprung on himself. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who severely underestimated your worth. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta, our family was entirely obsessed with the optics of Black excellence. My father, Harrison, a retired corporate logistics executive, demanded absolute perfection from his daughters. To the outside world, we were the picture of success. We attended the largest megachurch in the city, sat in the front pews, and hosted lavish Sunday dinners that looked like they belonged in a lifestyle magazine. But inside our sprawling brick estate, love was a currency that had to be earned through public prestige. My younger sister Jada understood this game perfectly. She was a former pageant queen turned local social media influencer, perpetually draped in designer labels funded by our father's rapidly dwindling credit cards. She was the golden child, the beautiful socialite who had fulfilled my father's ultimate dream by marrying Preston. Preston was a 36-year-old junior investment banker. He was white, fiercely smug, and walked around our family home with a breathtaking level of entitlement. He believed he was the smartest man in any room he entered, and frequently talked down to me as if I were a hired servant rather than a member of the family. To Harrison, Jada, and Preston represented the perfect continuation of his legacy. They had the right look, the right country club memberships, and the right social circles. I, on the other hand, was viewed as the family disappointment. Because I operated behind the scenes, wore practical scrubs, and did not marry into a legacy family, my father treated me like a peasant in my own home. He loved to tell his high society friends that I was just a spinster nurse who had thrown away a perfectly good degree from Howard University to be his glorified maid. He had no idea that I was actually the founder and chief executive officer of a highly lucrative, multi-state concierge medical agency. I kept my wealth entirely hidden because I knew exactly how my family operated. The ultimate disrespect occurred on a crisp Sunday afternoon late in October. The dining room table was set with the good Waterford crystal and the fine china that had been passed down from my grandmother. The smell of roasted lamb collard greens and fresh cornbread filled the air, masking the absolute toxicity brewing in the room. I had spent the entire morning adjusting my father's medication, checking his blood pressure, and ensuring his dietary needs were met. I had spent the last 8 years doing exactly this. When he had his massive stroke, Jada was too busy attending fashion weeks and posting vacation photos to even visit the hospital. Preston claimed the smell of antiseptic made him nauseous. I was the one who moved into the guest house. I was the one who bathed him, managed his grueling physical therapy, paid his daily living expenses, and slowly nursed him back to the arrogant, image-obsessed man sitting at the head of the table today. As we finished the main course, Harrison tapped his silver fork against his crystal wine glass. He cleared his throat, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He loved holding court, and today he had a captive audience. He announced that his recent health scare had forced him to think deeply about the future of our family name. He spoke at length about generational wealth, about building dynasties, and about ensuring that the family assets were managed by those who understood the brutal realities of the financial world. I sat quietly sipping my sparkling water, waiting for the inevitable blow. Because Jada has a growing family to support, and Preston has the financial pedigree to manage our investments, Harrison declared, his voice booming across the dining room. I have decided to update my estate plan. I am leaving the estate, the liquid assets, and the entirety of the family investment portfolios to Jada and Preston. They will ensure that our legacy continues to thrive." The room went completely silent. I felt the weight of his words settle over the table. 8 years of my life. 8 years of putting my own personal life on hold, of wiping his mouth when he could not speak, of carrying him to the bathroom when his legs gave out. And he was handing everything over to a man who mocked him behind his back, and a daughter who only showed up when the hard work was over. Harrison did not even look at me when he said it. He kept his eyes fixed proudly on Preston, seeking validation from the son-in-law he desperately wanted to impress. Preston leaned back in his chair, swirling an expensive glass of scotch. A smug, victorious grin spread across his face. He reached into his tailored slacks, pulled out his leather wallet, and extracted a crisp $100 bill. With agonizing slowness, he slid the bill across the polished mahogany table until it stopped right next to my water glass. "Do not worry, Kendra." Preston chuckled, his tone dripping with condescension. "We are not going to leave you out in the cold. We will still hire you at a competitive hourly rate to come by and check his blood pressure. Buy yourself something nice today." Jada let out a sharp musical laugh, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. "Honestly, Kendra, this is exactly what you need," she chimed in, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. "It is time you move out of the guest house and get a real job. You cannot keep hiding from the world, playing nurse to dad forever. We have big plans for the property, and we really need the guest house for Preston's parents when they visit from Connecticut. You understand, right? It is just business." I looked at the $100 bill resting on the table. I looked at Preston's arrogant blue eyes, at Jada's triumphant smirk, and finally at my father, who was cutting into his lamb as if he had not just discarded his own flesh and blood. They expected me to break down. They expected me to cry, to beg for my fair share, or to storm out of the house in a fit of hysterical rage. That was the narrative they had written for me. The bitter, jealous single sister throwing a tantrum. But I was not that woman. My grief had dried up years ago, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice by even a decibel. I calmly reached into my black designer tote bag resting at my feet. I pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope and placed it squarely next to Harrison's plate, right on top of his linen napkin. "What is this?" Harrison asked, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. "Inside that envelope, Dad, are the medical power of attorney documents, relinquishing my responsibilities, along with the keys to the guest house and the main gate," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly detached. "Since Preston is managing the legacy now, he can manage the arrears. You seem to have a very short memory regarding how this family actually operates. You used my entire college fund to pay for Jada's destination wedding in Lake Como 8 years ago. When I confronted you about it, you told me I had to sacrifice for the family's image. You said Black excellence requires stepping up when duty calls. Well, consider my sacrifice officially complete." Jada rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please, Kendra, are you really bringing up my wedding again? You are so obsessed with the past. Get over it. Preston is taking over the finances now. We are moving forward." "Yes, Preston is taking over the finances." I agreed, offering Preston a chilling smile, which brings me to the second document in that envelope. "You should probably read it, Dad." Harrison snatched the envelope, tearing the top open with aggressive impatience. He pulled out the stack of heavy legal papers. I watched his eyes scan the top page. I watched the exact second his brain processed the legal header. The arrogant, posturing patriarch vanished in an instant. The color rapidly drained from his face, replaced by a dark, suffocating purple. His hands began to tremble so violently that the paper shook in his grip. He slammed his fist down onto the mahogany table, rattling the fine china and spilling Preston's scotch. "You cannot be serious!" Harrison shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "What kind of sick joke is this, Kendra?" Preston frowned, dropping his smug facade. "What does it say, Harrison? What is the problem?" It is a 30-day eviction notice, I stated clearly, letting the words echo off the dining room walls. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. Jada's mouth dropped open, her eyes darting frantically between me and our father. An eviction notice, Preston scoffed, trying to regain control of the room. You cannot evict the owner of the house, Kendra. You are losing your mind. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, closing the distance between me and the family that had bled me dry. I did not just move into the guest house 8 years ago to change your bedpans and monitor your heart rate, Dad. I moved in because 5 years ago, your hidden sports gambling debts caught up with you. The bank was 30 days away from foreclosing on this entire estate. You were going to be thrown out onto the street, completely humiliated in front of your precious country club friends and your entire church congregation. You begged me to save you. That is a lie, Jada shrieked, standing up from her chair. Dad is a millionaire. He does not have gambling debts. Ask him. I challenged, not taking my eyes off my father. Go ahead, Jada. Ask the great patriarch how he lost his pension. Ask him why he had to secretly sign over the deed to avoid a public bankruptcy auction. Harrison could not look at her. He stared down at his plate, his breathing shallow and rapid. I bought this house out of foreclosure, I explained, turning my gaze to Preston. My limited liability company paid the bank $1.2 million in cash to clear the liens. I let him stay here rent-free under the condition that he maintain the property taxes, which he has failed to do for the last 3 quarters. You are not inheriting a legacy, Preston. You are inheriting a delusion. This estate belongs to my company. You are sitting in my dining room eating food paid for by my credit card, disrespecting me under my own roof. I picked up the $100 bill Preston had slid across the table. I folded it neatly in half and tucked it into his pristine shirt pocket. Keep your hourly rate, Preston. You are going to need every penny for the moving trucks. You have exactly 30 days to vacate my property. Have a blessed Sunday. The Monday morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office in Buckhead, casting a warm glow over the custom marble floors and the original abstract paintings lining the walls. I sat behind my massive tempered glass desk, sipping a fresh espresso. To my right sat Julian, my lead corporate attorney. He wore a bespoke navy suit and held a gold fountain pen, reviewing a stack of acquisition documents with the kind of ruthless precision I paid him 7 figures a year for. My life was a meticulously curated machine of efficiency and power. My family had absolutely no idea. Oh, the intercom on my desk buzzed sharply, breaking the quiet hum of the room. My executive assistant spoke, her voice laced with professional urgency. She told me 2 individuals were demanding to see me, immediately refusing to wait in the lobby and threatening to call security. Before I could even instruct her to let them through, the heavy frosted glass doors of my office were shoved open with violent force. Preston stormed into the room first, his face flushed a blotchy, angry red. Jada trailed right behind him, clutching a Chanel bag that I knew for a fact our father had paid for. They had marched downtown, fully expecting to corner me in some dingy, fluorescent-lit strip mall clinic. For years, Preston had loudly referred to my business as a cute little nursing hobby. He genuinely believed I spent my days changing bedpans and scraping together rent money. The moment they crossed the threshold, their aggressive momentum hit a brick wall. I watched their eyes dart around the sprawling suite. They took in the panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline, the leather lounge seating, and the 12-person mahogany conference table situated in the corner. Aegis Elite Care was not a hobby. It was a concierge medical empire catering to high-net-worth individuals, professional athletes, and legacy politicians across 3 states. Preston stopped dead in his tracks, his arrogant stride faltering as his brain struggled to process the wealth surrounding him. Jada looked like she had just been slapped. Her eyes widened as she took in the cut of my tailored blazer and the diamond stud earrings I wore, items she assumed a lowly nurse could never afford. I set my espresso cup down on the glass desk. The faint clink echoed in the sudden silence of the room. I asked them what exactly gave them the impression they could barge into my corporate headquarters without an appointment. Preston shook off his initial shock, puffing out his chest to regain his typical finance bro dominance. He marched right up to my desk and slammed his hands flat against the glass, leaning over to intimidate me. He told me I was not going to get away with this. He yelled that he knew exactly what kind of scam I was running. According to his brilliant deduction, I had used my position as my father's primary caregiver to manipulate a vulnerable, sick old man into signing away the deed to his multi-million-dollar estate. Jada immediately chimed in from behind him, placing a manicured hand over her heart in a practiced display of victimhood. She accused me of being a bitter, jealous spinster who was taking out her pathetic life frustrations on our father. She told me I had no right to steal the family legacy just because I was angry that she had a husband and a life while I was stuck playing nursemaid. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I sat comfortably in my ergonomic leather chair and let them talk. Julian simply turned the page of his legal document, not even bothering to look up at them. His utter lack of concern seemed to infuriate Preston even more. Preston pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. He laid out his grand ultimatum. He claimed to play golf every Saturday with the assistant district attorney. He threatened to call his friends at the prosecutor's office and have me brought up on federal charges for elder financial abuse, wire fraud, and coercion. He told me I was going to be in handcuffs by lunchtime unless I immediately signed a transfer deed handing the estate over to Jada. He demanded I surrender every asset I had stolen from Harrison and walk away quietly. He promised that if I complied, he might be generous enough not to press charges and ruin whatever miserable little life I had left. The sheer audacity of his threat hung in the air. Preston truly believed he was the apex predator in the room. He had spent his entire career in investment banking coasting on his privilege, entirely convinced that an African-American woman in healthcare could never outsmart him. He thought his empty threats of legal action would make me cower and beg for his mercy. He thought I was the same silent, obedient daughter who had quietly endured my family's relentless disrespect at every holiday dinner. I allowed him to scream until he was completely out of breath. I watched the veins pop in his neck and the sweat bead on his forehead. When the room finally fell silent, save for his heavy, angry breathing, I turned my head slightly toward Julian. I gave him a single subtle nod. Julian smoothly capped his gold fountain pen. Without saying a single word, he reached to the side of his chair, picked up a thick, heavy black binder, and slid it directly across the smooth glass desk until it bumped gently against Preston's knuckles. Preston stared at the heavy black leather binder resting against his knuckles. For a split second, the sheer physical weight of the object seemed to break his aggressive momentum. Jada let out a breathy, dismissive sound, crossing her arms tightly over her chest and shifting her weight from one designer stiletto to the other. She looked at the binder as if it were a biohazard, completely unwilling to touch anything that did not directly hand her money or status. Preston, quickly recovering his false bravado, sneered and tapped his index finger aggressively against the leather cover. He demanded to know if this was supposed to be my fake paper trail, doubling down on his wild accusation that I had somehow manipulated a helpless, sick old man into signing over the family estate. He told me that white-collar criminals always tried to bury the truth in paperwork, but he was an investment banker, and he knew exactly how to spot a fraud. That was the exact moment I let my polite silence end. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool, tempered glass of my desk, and looked him dead in the eyes. Manipulate, I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that commanded the entire room. Do you honestly think I needed to manipulate a man who was already drowning in his own manufactured ruin? Open the front flap of that binder, Preston. Look at the documents before you threaten me with federal charges. He hesitated, glancing nervously at Julian, who remained utterly motionless beside me. Reluctantly, Preston flipped the heavy cover open. I paid $1.2 million directly to the bank, I said, making sure every single syllable landed like a physical strike. I wired that money from my personal corporate holding account, while you two were busy posting glamorous selfies from a luxury ski lodge in Aspen. I remember that week vividly. Harrison was calling your cell phones dozens of times a day, desperate for a financial bailout, and both of you ignored his calls because you thought he was just being demanding and annoying. He was not calling to chat Jada. He was calling you because the bank was exactly 48 hours away from putting a public foreclosure notice on the front gate of the estate. You will find the verified wire transfers right there on page 1, properly documented, fully authenticated, alongside the official bank receipts, clearing all the property liens. You will also find his signed, notarized letter of gratitude from October of 2021, legally acknowledging that I saved him from total public humiliation and financial destruction. Jada scoffed, stepping closer to the desk to look over Preston's shoulder. She adamantly insisted that our father would never sign something like that, claiming he was far too proud a man to ever take a handout from me. She told me I must have forged his signature because Harrison always said I was barely scraping by on a nurse's salary. He did not take a handout, Jada. I corrected her sharply, my voice cutting through her delusion. He made a desperate business transaction to save his precious country club reputation. He lay in a hospital bed recovering from a stroke and literally wept, begging me to keep his financial failures a secret from his golf buddies and his church congregation. He could not stomach the idea of the city knowing he had squandered his fortune. That is exactly why there is a strict non-disclosure agreement attached to the deed transfer. So, Preston, if you want to go to court and sue me for elder financial abuse, let us go right now. Julian can have the defensive filings ready before you even reach the lobby elevator. But you need to understand one crucial detail before you make that call. The absolute moment we step into a courtroom, that non-disclosure agreement is officially voided. The entire city of Atlanta will know that the great Harrison lost his legacy to an illegal offshore sports betting syndicate. Preston swallowed hard, his arrogant blue eyes rapidly scanning the notarized signatures and bank stamps on the documents. The vibrant red flush of his anger was rapidly fading into a sickly pale realization. The legal paperwork was absolutely bulletproof, handled by a team of corporate sharks who ate arrogant men like Preston for breakfast. But Julian was not finished. My attorney calmly reached over and flipped the heavy plastic divider to the next section, instructing Preston to look at the second document. Preston stared at the page, his hands visibly shaking now. Jada leaned in closer, her perfectly arched brow furrowing as she looked at the massive spreadsheet filling the page. It was not a legal brief. It was an invoice. It was a meticulously detailed 80-page itemized invoice generated directly by the billing department of Aegis Elite Care. What on earth is this? Jada demanded, her voice losing its usual entitled breathy edge. That is the true cost of my sacrifice, I told her, sitting back in my ergonomic leather chair. For the past 8 years, I did not just live in that guest house to keep our father company or hold his hand. Following his severe stroke, Harrison required 24-hour elite medical care. He required specialized physical therapists, imported cardiovascular medications, and a private high-end nutritionist to manage his heavily restricted diet. Aegis Elite Care provided all of those services round the clock. Furthermore, when he absolutely insisted on keeping up his high society appearances, I personally covered his out-of-pocket lifestyle expenses to keep his secret safe. I paid for the tailored designer suits he wore to church on Sundays. I paid for the private chef who catered your lavish holiday dinners, the ones you took credit for online. I even paid the premium landscaping company so the estate always looked pristine for your Instagram aesthetic. I watched their eyes travel down the columns of numbers, finally landing on the bold bottom line on the final page of the summary. The total cost of 8 years of elite concierge medical care and sustained luxury living was exactly $842,615. Jada let out a loud, incredulous gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. She slapped her palm against the glass desk, her eyes wide with manufactured horror. "You are billing your own father!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings of the penthouse. "You are actually trying to charge family for taking care of family. What kind of heartless, money-hungry monster are you? You are his daughter, Kendra. You are a nurse. You are supposed to do this out of the goodness of your heart, out of love for the man who raised us." I did not flinch at her ridiculous theatrics. I looked at her with pure, unadulterated calm. I told her I am not just a nurse. I am the chief executive officer of a massive healthcare empire, and this is a strictly corporate business transaction. You stood in my dining room yesterday and told me to get a real job, Jada. This is it. Aegis Elite Care provided extensive medical services to Harrison as a client. Now that he has officially transferred his entire estate to you and Preston, he has essentially severed our verbal agreement and closed out his accounts with my company. That means his outstanding medical debt is due immediately. Since Preston is so eager to step up and manage the grand family legacy, he can figure out how to settle the balance. Preston stared at the staggering number at the bottom of the page. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as he desperately searched for a way out of this trap, trying to calculate how to leverage his way out of an $800,000 medical bill. Then, incredibly, Preston threw his head back and laughed. It was a harsh barking sound devoid of any actual humor, but dripping with his signature unearned arrogance. He slammed the binder shut with a loud crack, tossing it back across the desk toward Julian. "Is that all, Kendra?" he asked, crossing his arms over his chest and leaning back desperately, trying to reclaim his posture of superiority. "You really think an $800,000 medical bill is going to scare us? You think this is some kind of brilliant master checkmate? You clearly have absolutely no idea what you are dealing with." Jada immediately mirrored his false confidence, pulling her shoulders back and lifting her chin in defiance. She told me I was pathetic and desperate for trying to squeeze money out of them like a common bill collector. She proudly announced that our father had transferred all his liquid assets, his offshore accounts, and his vast investment portfolios into a brand new family trust managed entirely by Preston. She bragged that they had millions at their disposal and that paying off my petty little invoice would not even make a dent in their luxurious new lifestyle. Preston nodded in agreement, flashing that infuriatingly smug grin that always made my blood boil. He told me to have Julian send the official bill directly to his investment firm downtown. He promised he would happily wire the funds by the end of the week, just to get me out of their lives permanently. He called my $800,000 invoice absolute chump change for a man with Harrison's deep pockets. He told me I could take my little medical payout, go back to my sad, lonely single life, and leave the real corporate business to the adults who knew how to handle money. I did not react to the insult. I did not need to defend my life, my achievements, or my business to a junior banker who was currently standing on the edge of a cliff blindfolded. I just let a slow, icy smile spread across my face. I picked up my espresso cup, taking a calm, deliberate sip of the dark coffee before setting it back down gently on its matching ceramic saucer. "You are absolutely right, Preston," I said softly, my voice perfectly steady and dripping with anticipation. "You are the financial genius here. You are the hotshot investment banker who knows exactly how to manage a high net worth portfolio. So tell me something. Have you actually checked those trust accounts since the estate transfer was legally finalized yesterday afternoon?" Preston's arrogant smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. He frowned, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read my expression. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice suddenly thick with defensive panic. "I have full access to the family trust. I have the routing numbers and the authorization codes. The assets are fully secured." "Then try logging into them," I suggested, gesturing gracefully toward the door. "Go ahead. Pull out your phone right now, open your high-end banking app, and try to move a single dollar from Harrison's precious legacy trust." Jada looked at her husband, a flash of genuine terror finally breaking through her entitled designer-clad facade. Preston pulled his sleek smartphone from his suit pocket, his thumb jabbing aggressively at the screen. He muttered under his breath that I was bluffing, that I was just a bitter woman trying to buy time, but the frantic speed at which he was trying to access the banking portal told a completely different story. I leaned back in my leather executive chair, steepling my fingers together as I watched the blood completely drain from his face. "Those accounts were frozen solid at exactly 8 o'clock this morning," I informed him, watching his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated horror as his screen displayed glaring red error messages. "You see, when our father was desperately moving money around 5 years ago to cover those massive offshore gambling debts, he made a very critical, highly illegal error on his federal tax returns. He claimed massive fraudulent losses to avoid paying capital gains taxes on properties he did not actually own. I have been quietly working with a top-tier forensic accountant to keep the federal auditors at bay while he recovered from his stroke, shielding him from the fallout and paying the penalties out of my own pocket to keep him out of federal prison. But the exact moment he signed the entire estate over to you and voided our verbal arrangement, my legal obligation to protect his financial secrets completely evaporated. Preston stared blindly at his phone, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. Jada grabbed his arm, shaking him violently and screaming at him to tell her what was happening. I stood up slowly, resting my hands flat on the glass desk, towering over them both, with absolute, undeniable authority. Did Harrison forget to mention the massive Internal Revenue Service lien Preston? The federal government just locked down every single asset, every liquid account, and every investment portfolio attached to his name. The millions you thought you were inheriting do not exist. They belong entirely to the federal government. You did not inherit a legacy, Preston. You inherited an $800,000 medical debt, and you have exactly $0 to pay it. The heavy oak doors of Greater Zion Cathedral had always felt welcoming to me right up until this exact Sunday morning. As I stepped into the sprawling chandelier-lit foyer of the mega church, the atmosphere immediately shifted. The usual warm greetings, the polite embraces from the congregation, the cheerful inquiries about my medical practice, they were all entirely absent. Instead, I was met with hard stares, aggressive whispers, and the distinct feeling of walking blindly into a carefully orchestrated trap. The air was thick with judgment. Harrison and Jada had clearly spent the last 48 hours doing exactly what they did best. They had spun an absolute masterpiece of victimhood, and they had used the holiest place in our community as their personal stage. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored emerald suit, lifted my chin and walked directly into the massive fellowship hall following the 2-hour morning service. The room was buzzing with hundreds of Atlanta's elite congregants sipping imported coffee and eating catered pastries. I did not even make it halfway to the refreshment table before the blockade formed. A solid wall of church elders led by Mother Vivian and Aunt Shirley stepped purposefully into my path. They were draped in their finest Sunday suits and oversized hats, looking at me with expressions of pure, unadulterated disgust. Mother Vivian crossed her arms over her chest, her jaw set tight. She told me I ought to be deeply ashamed of myself to show my face in the house of the Lord after what I had done to my own flesh and blood. Aunt Shirley chimed in immediately, her voice raised just enough to ensure the surrounding tables ceased their conversations so they could hear every single word. She accused me of being a bitter, resentful woman. She said it was a complete tragedy that I had chosen to punish a disabled, highly respected community leader, just because I was rapidly approaching 40 without a husband or a family of my own. She looked me up and down, sneering that my professional success meant absolutely nothing if my heart was rotten with jealousy over my younger sister's beautiful marriage and her charming, successful husband. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely unbothered. I looked at these women who had gladly accepted the free blood pressure clinics, the diabetes management seminars, and the comprehensive health screenings I had personally funded for this congregation for the past 3 years. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of the anger simmering beneath my calm exterior. I simply asked them if they had actually bothered to ask Harrison why the bank was legally involved with his estate in the first place. I asked if they truly knew the man they were defending, or if they were just blindly swallowing the fabricated lies of a man who spent more time transferring funds to offshore casinos than he ever did in the prayer circle. Before Aunt Shirley could gasp at my absolute audacity, a heavy, authoritative hand rested firmly on my shoulder. I turned to face Pastor Williams. He was a towering, imposing figure in the community, a man whose approval my father treated like absolute gold, and whose word was considered gospel in this city. His face was a strict mask of solemn disappointment. He did not greet me warmly or offer a pastoral blessing. Instead, He gripped my elbow with forceful pressure and guided me toward the center of the fellowship hall, deliberately positioning us where the maximum number of influential congregants could witness my reprimand. He lowered his head, but his booming baritone voice easily carried across the suddenly quiet room. He quoted scripture directly at me, loudly reminding me of the sacred commandment to honor thy father and mother. He told me that my father had come to his private office in tears the previous night, completely broken by the unprovoked cruelty of his eldest daughter. He said Harrison had confessed that I was using an obscure manipulative legal loophole to throw him and Jada out onto the street out of pure spite. According to the pastor, my father was a victim of my unchristian greed, a frail man being bullied by a daughter who worshipped money over family. I glanced over the pastor's broad shoulder. Standing near the coffee station, perfectly framed by the morning sunlight pouring through the stained glass windows, was Jada. She was wearing a modest, muted beige dress that was entirely out of character for her usual flashy aesthetic, and she was dabbing at her completely dry eyes with a monogrammed tissue. Several prominent church members were hovering around her, patting her back and offering sympathetic murmurs, while she played the role of the traumatized innocent sister facing sudden homelessness. I could see her whispering to the choir director about how she was so terrified for her family's future, putting on a performance worthy of a daytime television drama. Pastor Williams demanded my full attention, his tone shifting sharply from spiritual guidance to ruthless, calculated business. He informed me that the church board had convened an emergency meeting early that morning prior to the service. Because of my alleged lack of basic Christian charity and the scandalous nature of my actions against my own father, the board was officially reconsidering the massive, highly lucrative medical contract they had with my company, Aegis Elite Care. I had built the medical program for their Zion Senior Living facility from the ground up, reducing resident emergency room visits by 50% and providing top-tier care. But the pastor stated point blank that the church could not, in good conscience, retain a medical director who would ruthlessly evict her own disabled father from his lifelong home. He looked down at me, his eyes narrowing with a quiet, undeniable threat. He told me that unless I immediately dropped the eviction proceedings, tore up the absurd medical invoice I had presented to Preston, and fully restored my father's dignity and his property, my multi-million-dollar contract with the church would be permanently terminated by the end of the business day. Furthermore, he promised to make sure every other megachurch and private facility in the greater Atlanta area knew exactly why my contract had been severed. He stood tall, fully expecting me to crumble under the immense weight of his influence. He expected me to bow my head, beg for his forgiveness, and immediately surrender my legal assets to save my business reputation and my social standing. He genuinely thought the terrifying threat of public humiliation and massive financial loss would break me into absolute submission, just like it had always broken my father. He assumed I was a woman who could be easily intimidated by loud men making grand threats in crowded rooms. I looked at the pastor. I looked at the gossiping church elders leaning in to hear my response. I looked past them to Jada, who was watching me with a faint, victorious smirk, now failing to hide behind her crumpled tissue. I did not cower. I did not apologize. I did not shed a single tear of repentance. Instead, I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my iPad Pro. I calmly walked over to the massive 75-inch smart television mounted on the main wall of the fellowship hall, a high-definition screen typically used to display church announcements, community outreach photos, and weekly donation goals. I tapped the screen of my tablet, activated the wireless display feature, and seamlessly synced my device to the church's monitor. The screen flashed to life, casting a bright, unmistakable glow over the faces of the congregation. The quiet murmurs in the room instantly died down as hundreds of eyes turned toward the glowing display. I turned back to face the crowd. My posture relaxed, but my voice ringing out clear, steady, and commanding over the dead silence of the fellowship hall. I looked directly into Pastor Williams' eyes, offering him a smile that was colder than ice. "Pastor Williams," I said, making sure my voice reached the very back of the room, since we are standing here talking about honor, integrity, and basic Christian charity in the house of the Lord. Let us take a closer look at the real definition of honor. The massive 75-inch display mounted above the refreshment table flickered, then illuminated the fellowship hall with crystal clarity. Hundreds of eyes instantly darted upward. The ambient noise of clinking coffee cups and hushed gossip ceased completely. I did not show them a carefully curated slideshow of family photos. I showed them raw, unredacted financial truth. The first document on the screen was a consolidated bank ledger. I highlighted a specific column of outgoing wire transfers spanning the last 5 years. I looked directly at Pastor Williams, watching his authoritative posture stiffen. I reminded the crowd that every single Thanksgiving and Easter Harrison stood at this exact pulpit. He commanded the attention of the entire congregation as he handed over massive, oversized novelty checks to the youth ministry and the building expansion fund. The congregation nodded. They all remembered those grand displays of generosity. They remembered clapping for the great Harrison, praising his devotion to the community. I swiped my finger across the tablet. The screen zoomed in on the origin accounts for every single one of those charitable donations. The routing numbers did not belong to Harrison. They belonged to the corporate holding accounts of Aegis Elite Care. I funded every single one of his public acts of charity. I quietly bled my own company profits so my father could stand in front of this church and play the role of the benevolent patriarch. I let him take the absolute credit because I wanted to protect his pride. But he was donating money he did not have, buying social influence with my hard-earned capital. A collective gasp rippled through the fellowship hall. Aunt Shirley, who had just minutes ago accused me of being a jealous spinster, suddenly looked as though all the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Mother Vivian clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes darting frantically between the undeniable bank records on the screen and my perfectly calm face. But I was not finished. I swiped to the next slide. The second document was a commercial lending agreement. If the previous revelation had shocked the congregation, this one completely paralyzed them. I looked directly into Pastor Williams' eyes. I told him that 2 years ago, Harrison was desperate. He had accumulated another massive wave of offshore gambling debts, and his bookies were threatening to make his profound failures public. He needed cash immediately. He took out a high-interest predatory commercial loan. I zoomed in on the guarantor section of the contract. I pointed to the glowing text on the screen. To secure that massive loan, Harrison used Greater Zion Cathedral as his primary character reference and his collateral guarantor. He forged financial projection documents implying that the church was financially backing his private investment venture. The blood instantly drained from Pastor Williams' face. His booming, imposing demeanor vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. He understood exactly what that document meant. I spelled it out for the rest of the room so there could be no misunderstanding. I explained that if Harrison had defaulted on that specific loan, the predatory creditors would not have come after his empty bank accounts. They would have come directly after the church. They would have placed liens on the sanctuary. They would have seized the building expansion funds. They would have bankrupted the senior living facility and thrown dozens of elderly congregants out onto the street. I swiped to the final slide. It was a continuous receipt of payments. I told the pastor that he did not need to worry. The church was safe. The creditors were not coming. I showed them that for the past 24 months, I had been quietly paying off that fraudulent predatory loan. I had been making the exorbitant monthly payments out of my own pocket to ensure the church was never implicated in Harrison's devastating financial crimes. I protected this community from a massive scandal that would have resulted in federal investigations and the total destruction of this ministry. I did it silently, without asking for recognition, without asking for a plaque with my name on it. I disconnected my iPad. The screen went black, plunging the front of the hall back into natural sunlight. The silence that followed was absolute. No one whispered. No one moved. The undeniable proof of my sacrifice and Harrison's ultimate deception hung over the room like a heavy storm cloud. I turned away from the pastor and slowly walked over to Jada. She was backing away, her spine pressing against the edge of the refreshment table. Her fake performative tears were entirely gone. Her face was a mask of genuine raw panic. She looked at the faces of the church elders who had been comforting her just moments ago. Those same women were now glaring at her with profound disgust, realizing they had been used as pawns in a pathetic smear campaign. Jada opened her mouth to speak, but she had absolutely no script for this reality. She had spent her entire life skating by on manufactured charm and playing the victim. She had always relied on Harrison to shield her from consequences, and she had relied on me to quietly pay the bills. I stopped right in front of her. I looked at the expensive designer dress she was wearing, a dress I now knew was purchased with funds meant for her father's medical care. You wanted the spotlight, sis. You can have the debt that comes with it. I kept my voice low, but the absolute silence of the room ensured everyone heard me. For years I sat in the background. I let you take the credit for the lavish holiday dinners. I let you parade around in designer clothes while playing the perfect devoted golden child. I worked 80-hour weeks to build a medical empire from the ground up to keep the walls from caving in on all of us. I carried the heavy lifting while you posed for the cameras and complained about how hard your life was. Now the illusion is completely shattered. You and Preston marched into my office and demanded the estate. You demanded the legacy. Congratulations, Jada. You legally own it all now. You own the fraud. You own the IRS liens. You own the furious creditors. It is all yours. Jada let out a strangled, pathetic sob. She looked around the room, desperate for a single sympathetic face. She found none. Pastor William stepped forward. He did not look at Jada. He deliberately turned his back on her, physically distancing himself from her deceit. He walked over to me, his shoulders slumped, his imposing height suddenly feeling much smaller. He lowered his head and formally apologized. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke. He stated clearly in front of the entire congregation that he had been gravely mistaken. He explicitly confirmed that the church's medical contract with Aegis Elite Care would remain entirely intact and that he would personally ensure my company was recommended to every other senior facility in the diocese. He then turned his attention back to the crowd. He announced that Harrison's actions were a profound betrayal of the church's sacred trust. Effective immediately, Harrison was permanently stripped of his title as a community elder. He was no longer welcome to serve on any financial or advisory boards. The legacy Harrison had built his entire life around was officially dead, buried under the weight of his own fraudulent greed. The humiliation was absolute. Jada could not withstand the collective burning glare of the congregation. She grabbed Preston by the arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the fabric of his suit. Together they practically sprinted out of the fellowship hall, shoving their way through the heavy oak doors to escape the suffocating reality of their total exposure. I did not rush. I calmly slid my iPad back into my blazer pocket. I smoothed the lapels of my emerald suit, offered a polite professional nod to Mother Vivian and Aunt Shirley, who both immediately looked down at their shoes in deep shame, and proceeded to walk out of the church at a leisurely, controlled pace. I stepped out through the front doors and into the bright, blinding Sunday sunlight. The heat of the Atlanta morning rolled over me, but the church parking lot was anything but peaceful. Preston was pacing frantically next to his leased luxury SUV. The arrogant, untouchable investment banker who had threatened me with federal charges just 24 hours earlier was completely unraveling. He was sweating profusely, dark patches forming under the arms of his expensive tailored suit. He was dragging his hands through his perfectly styled hair, muttering expletives under his breath. He had finally calculated the exact reality of his situation. By forcing the legal transfer of Harrison's estate, Preston had unknowingly anchored himself to millions of dollars in fraudulent debt. The IRS was not just going to seize Harrison's non-existent assets, they were going to audit Preston's firm. Jada was standing by the passenger door, hysterically demanding that Preston fix it, screaming that she could not be poor, that she would not lose her country club membership. Furious, cornered, and entirely desperate, Preston made his final fatal error. He stopped pacing. He popped the trunk of his SUV with violent force. He reached inside and pulled out his sleek silver corporate laptop. He slammed the trunk shut and rested the computer directly on the hot metal hood of his car. His fingers were flying across the keyboard with frantic, uncoordinated speed. I stopped at the top of the concrete steps, watching him from a distance. I knew exactly what he was doing. Preston was logging into his investment firm's highly secure restricted servers over an unsecured public network. In a blind panic to save his own skin, he was attempting to illegally transfer his personal assets offshore, or worse, siphon client funds to cover the massive federal liens before the government officially revoked his trading licenses. He was committing real-time corporate fraud right in the middle of a church parking lot. I stood perfectly still in the warm sunlight, watching him dig his own financial grave. Preston's manic fingers slammed against the keyboard of his silver corporate laptop, the bright screen glaring harshly against the hot metal hood of his luxury SUV. From the top of the concrete church steps, I could easily read the frantic, jerky movements of his body. He was entirely consumed by panic. Jada stood just a few feet away from him, clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver, her voice shrill and demanding as she ordered him to fix the disaster I had just dropped into their laps. Suddenly, Preston stopped typing. He froze, staring at his screen as the grim reality of his situation finally registered. Whatever backdoor he was trying to access, whatever offshore account he was attempting to siphon client funds into it, was completely walled off. The federal government did not play games with fraudulent capital gains, and his firm's compliance department had clearly already initiated lockdown protocols on his trading credentials. He slammed the laptop shut with a violent curse, shoved Jada into the passenger seat of the SUV, and peeled out of the church parking lot. The tires shrieked against the asphalt, leaving thick black scuff marks behind as they sped off toward the highway. I took a slow, deep breath of the humid Atlanta air. The suffocating weight of my family's constant lingering judgment had entirely evaporated. I walked to my own car, a sleek, heavily tinted sedan, and slid into the quiet, air-conditioned interior. I did not immediately start the engine. I sat in the driver's seat, letting the profound silence of my own autonomy wash over me. Before I could even press the ignition button, the secure encrypted line on my mobile phone blared to life. The caller ID flashed a single name, Marcus. Marcus was the Chief Information Security Officer for Aegis Elite Care. I paid him a premium salary to ensure that the private medical records, financial data, and personal itineraries of my high-net-worth clients were protected by military-grade encryption. Marcus did not call me on a Sunday morning unless the building was physically burning down or we were under a catastrophic digital assault. I answered the phone, my voice perfectly level. "Tell me what is happening." "Kendra, we have a massive problem," Marcus said, his voice clipped and laced with adrenaline. "We just caught a severe intrusion attempt on the primary external firewall. Someone is actively trying to brute force their way into the Aegis proprietary servers. They started with a basic credential stuffing attack, but when that failed, they immediately pivoted to a highly sophisticated backdoor entry protocol. They are using top-tier investment banking credentials to mask their digital footprint." I stared straight ahead through the windshield, watching the last of the church congregation filtering out of the sanctuary. My mind connected the dots with lethal precision. Preston. He had realized that he could not save Harrison's frozen accounts, and he could not steal from his own firm without instantly triggering a federal wire fraud alert. He was completely broke-cornered by the IRS and facing total bankruptcy. He needed a massive, untraceable lifeline, and he needed it right this second. "He was targeting my company. He is going after the client database," I said, gripping the leather steering wheel. Preston knew exactly what kind of concierge empire I ran. He knew that Aegis Elite Care serviced legacy politicians, professional athletes, tech billionaires, and international royalty. That specific highly confidential client list, containing their private contact information, their financial billing profiles, and their discrete medical vulnerabilities, was worth tens of millions of dollars on the corporate black market. Private equity firms and rival medical conglomerates would pay an absolute fortune to acquire that data. Preston intended to steal my entire database, sell it to the highest bidder, and use the stolen capital to cover his fraudulent tracks before the federal auditors knocked on his door. "The intrusion is pinging from a mobile network," Marcus continued, the rapid clicking of his keyboard echoing through the phone speaker. The IP address is bouncing, but the origin signal is moving north on the interstate, headed directly toward Buckhead. It is a highly aggressive attack, Kendra. He is throwing everything he has at the perimeter wall. Do I have your official authorization to initiate the kill switch protocol? I can lock him out completely, sever his connection, and immediately forward his captured MAC address to the Federal Cybercrimes Division. I sat in the quiet hum of my car, my eyes narrowing as a profound, terrifying calm settled over my mind. I thought back to Thanksgiving dinner exactly 2 years ago. I remembered sitting at the long, polished dining table while Preston drunkenly bragged to our father about his investment firm's multi-million-dollar tech infrastructure. I remembered Preston looking directly at me, swirling his bourbon glass and loudly mocking my operational budget. He had casually joked that a glorified nurse wouldn't know an enterprise server from a syringe. He had spent his entire life underestimating my intelligence, my resources, and my absolute ruthlessness. He genuinely believed that because I worked in healthcare, my digital security was weak, vulnerable, and ripe for the picking. Marcus, I said, my voice dropping an octave, radiating pure, calculated strategy. Do not lock him out. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Kendra, did you hear what I just said? He is actively trying to breach the central client architecture. If he gets his hands on those files, we are looking at a catastrophic HIPAA violation and the end of this company. I hear you perfectly, I replied, starting the engine of my car. And I am telling you to let him in. Marcus let out a sharp breath, clearly struggling to process the command. You want me to let a hostile intruder bypass our firewall. I want you to set a trap, Marcus. Drop the secondary firewall protocols just enough to make him believe he successfully cracked the system. When he breaches the perimeter, do not let him anywhere near the actual proprietary database. Route his connection directly into the quarantine sandbox. Put him in the honeypot. The honeypot was a masterpiece of digital deception that Marcus and I had designed for exactly this kind of scenario. It was an isolated, heavily monitored dummy server. To an outside hacker, it looked exactly like the primary Aegis Elite Care database. It had the same file structures, the same encryption layers, and the same terrifyingly massive data folders. But it was entirely fake. It contained hundreds of thousands of fabricated client profiles, completely bogus financial records, and dummy medical histories. More importantly, every single file inside the honeypot was embedded with aggressive microscopic tracking beacons. The absolute second someone downloaded a file from that sandbox and attempted to open it on an external network, the beacon would silently deploy. It would instantly log their physical location, capture their hard drive data, and transmit a permanent, undeniable record of federal cyber theft directly to the authorities. Preston wanted to play the role of the apex predator. He wanted to steal my life's work to save his own miserable skin. I was going to give him the shovel and let him dig until he could not see the sunlight anymore. Understood, Marcus said, his voice instantly shifting from panic to predatory focus. I am isolating the genuine servers now. I am opening a false gateway in the tertiary firewall. I am routing his IP directly into the sandbox. I pulled out of the church parking lot, merging onto the highway and heading toward my penthouse in Buckhead. Keep the line open, Marcus. Walk me through it. For the next 20 minutes, the Bluetooth speaker in my car relayed the systematic destruction of Preston's future. Marcus provided a cold, clinical play-by-play of the cyber intrusion. He is through the false gateway, Marcus reported, the satisfaction clear in his tone. He is bypassing the decoy security measures. He is moving incredibly fast, Kendra. He is completely reckless. He is not even trying to mask his digital signature anymore. He thinks he just hit the mother lode. Let him take whatever he wants. I instructed, changing lanes smoothly. Make sure he sees the folder labeled Tier 1 Concierge Assets. He found it, Marcus confirmed a moment later. He is initiating a mass data transfer. He is downloading the entire dummy database directly to his local hard drive. I smiled, watching the Atlanta skyline rise up in the distance. The brilliance of the trap was its absolute finality. Preston was currently downloading gigabytes of highly illegal, federally protected data. He was committing corporate espionage, grand larceny, and severe cyber fraud, completely unaware that he was sealing his own permanent destruction. Once he had those files on his computer, he would try to open them at his firm to assess their value. The moment he clicked on a single document, the tracking beacons would detonate. The FBI would have an undeniable digital confession proving that a licensed investment banker was actively attempting to fence stolen medical data to cover his tax fraud. Transfer is complete. Marcus announced the finality ringing through the car speakers. He has the files. He just severed the connection. He is gone. Lock the honeypot down, document the entire intrusion log, and prepare the data packet for the Federal Cybercrimes Division I ordered. We do not contact the authorities until Monday morning. Let him spend the night thinking he actually won. Let him sleep soundly before the federal agents kick his front door off the hinges. Excellent strategy, boss. I will have the complete digital forensics report on your desk by 6 tomorrow morning. I ended the call just as I pulled into the private underground parking garage of my penthouse building. The heavy security gates closed behind me, shutting out the noise and chaos of the city. I stepped onto the private elevator, swiped my key fob, and rode up to the top floor in total silence. I walked into my sprawling, sunlit living room. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the empire I had built with my own 2 hands. I had survived the emotional abuse, the constant belittling, the financial manipulations, and the endless smear campaigns. I had outsmarted the people who were supposed to protect me, but who had chosen to prey on me instead. I poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water, added a slice of fresh lemon, and stood by the window watching the city breathe below me. My phone chimed, vibrating sharply against the marble kitchen counter. I picked it up. It was a direct text message from Jada. I did not need to guess the tone. I knew it would be radiating her signature arrogant delusion. She genuinely believed they had just pulled off the greatest heist of the century. She thought they had successfully outmaneuvered me, stolen my assets, and secured their luxurious future. I tapped the screen and opened the message. A real woman knows how to rely on a smart man. Preston fixed Dad's accounts. You can keep your little nursing business, we don't need you anymore. I read Jada's text message again, the sheer audacity of her words echoing in the quiet luxury of my penthouse. A real woman knows how to rely on a smart man. Preston fixed Dad's accounts. You can keep your little nursing business, we don't need you anymore. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that broke the absolute silence of my living room. I set my phone down on the smooth marble of my kitchen island just as the private elevator doors chimed and slid open. My executive assistant, Elena, stepped into the penthouse. She was carrying a thick, leather-bound portfolio and a fresh iced coffee, looking every bit the ruthless corporate operative I had trained her to be. Elena walked straight over to the kitchen island and laid the portfolio open in front of me. She handed me a gold fountain pen and pointed to the glowing signature line on the final page of the contract. It was the finalized paperwork for a $5 million commercial real estate acquisition. Aegis Elite Care was officially purchasing a massive state-of-the-art rehabilitation facility in downtown Charlotte. I was actively expanding my concierge medical empire across state lines, solidifying my position as one of the most powerful independent healthcare CEOs in the Southeast. I signed my name with smooth practice strokes, legally authorizing the multi-million-dollar corporate expansion without a single ounce of hesitation. I capped the pen, handed the heavy portfolio back to Elena, and slid my phone across the cool marble counter toward her. Read that, I instructed, leaning back and crossing my arms. Elena picked up the phone. Her eyes quickly scanned Jada's text message. A wry, knowing smile spread across her face as she set the device back down. She shook her head, thoroughly amused by the absolute delusion radiating from my sister. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. Jada has spent the last 10 years making sure I knew exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Every single Thanksgiving, every Christmas dinner, every minor holiday gathering, she paraded Preston around the dining room table like he was a conquering hero. She would look at my single status, look at my medical scrubs, and loudly announced that a real woman needed a finance bro to secure her future. She constantly mocked me for working 80-hour weeks to build my company, telling our parents that my ambition was just a sad compensation for not having a husband to take care of me. Elena scoffed, organizing the acquisition contracts. She clearly does not understand that you could buy Preston's entire investment firm and liquidate it just for fun. No, she does not, I agreed softly. Jada genuinely believes that a man in a tailored suit with a corner office is the ultimate safety net. She thinks Preston is the smartest person in any room he walks into. Well, Elena, we are about to find out exactly how smart her finance bro really is when the federal government comes knocking on his door. The files Preston had frantically downloaded from my dummy server were not just a random list of fake client names. Marcus and I had spent months engineering the honeypot for maximum legal radioactivity. The decoy folder Preston had stolen, labeled Tier 1 Concierge Assets, contained highly sophisticated, meticulously fabricated financial portfolios. We had generated dummy routing numbers for phantom offshore accounts, falsified corporate promissory notes, and massive bogus accounts, receivable ledgers. To a desperate investment banker looking for a quick, untraceable influx of cash, those files looked like an absolute goldmine. They looked like tens of millions of dollars in unmonitored liquid medical assets just waiting to be quietly leveraged. Preston was entirely bankrupt. The IRS had a federal stranglehold on Harrison's estate, and Preston was legally anchored to the entire disaster. He needed an exorbitant amount of capital to pay off the massive federal liens before the government officially audited his personal accounts and revoked his trading licenses. He was completely out of time, out of money, and out of options. Monday morning arrived with the relentless, aggressive energy of a corporate battlefield. I sat at the head of my glass conference table at the Aegis headquarters, nursing my second espresso of the day. Marcus was sitting directly across from me, his eyes locked onto his encrypted monitoring laptop. The digital tracking beacons we had embedded in the honeypot files were officially live. "He is moving," Marcus announced, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he tracked Preston's digital footprint in real time. He just logged into his investment firm's internal banking terminal. He is using his senior vice president credentials to bypass the standard security protocols. What exactly is he doing? I asked, watching the complex stream of data scrolling across Marcus's screen. He is leveraging the phantom assets, Marcus replied, a note of sheer disbelief coloring his voice. He took the fabricated medical billing receivables from the honeypot, and he is using them as guaranteed collateral to apply for a massive corporate bridge loan. He is setting up a rapid shell corporation and attempting to push the loan through his firm's expedited underwriting department. He is claiming that he is facilitating a private acquisition of Aegis Elite Care assets. I rested my chin on my folded hands, a slow, predatory smile touching my lips. Preston was utilizing his senior banking authority to essentially approve his own fraudulent loan. He planned to use the stolen fake medical assets to instantly generate enough liquid cash to pay off Harrison's catastrophic debts and save his own luxurious lifestyle from total collapse. It was a breathtakingly arrogant move. It was also wire fraud, bank fraud, identity theft, and corporate espionage all rolled into one massive, undeniable felony. He is rushing the paperwork, Marcus reported, his eyes darting across the monitor. He is bypassing the secondary compliance checks. He is desperate, Kendra. He is moving so fast, he is leaving a digital trail a mile wide. The embedded beacons are logging his exact keystrokes, his IP address, and his internal firm credentials. Let him finish. I commanded, my voice perfectly steady. Do not interrupt the transfer. We need him to fully execute the crime. The conference room was completely silent, except for the frantic clicking of Marcus's keyboard. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the anticipation of a flawlessly executed trap. Preston thought he was the ultimate corporate predator. He thought he was saving his family legacy and proving his absolute superiority over the lowly nurse he had mocked for a decade. He had absolutely no idea that he was currently signing his own federal arrest warrant. He just submitted the application, Marcus announced, hitting a final key on his laptop. The loan request is officially pending in his firm's active queue. He pledged the fake assets as collateral, The fraud is officially executed. He crossed the line. I did not wait. I did not offer a warning, and I certainly did not intend to negotiate. Compile the complete data packet, I instructed Marcus, standing up from my executive chair and smoothing my tailored blazer. I want every single server log, the complete IP tracking data, the embedded beacon alerts, and a crystal clear copy of that fraudulent loan application he just submitted. Marcus hit a series of commands on his laptop. The encrypted file is compiled and locked, sending it to your secure terminal now. I walked back into my private office and sat down at my desk. I opened my encrypted email client and attached the massive damning data packet Marcus had just generated. I did not send the file to the local police, and I did not send it to Preston's compliance department. I addressed the message to two very specific, highly powerful contacts I had cultivated over years of building a pristine, legally flawless corporate healthcare business. The first recipient was a senior director at the Securities and Exchange Commission, a man who aggressively prosecuted rogue investment bankers. The second recipient was a lead investigator for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. I typed a brief, highly professional message outlining the exact nature of the cyber intrusion, the theft of proprietary medical data, and the active ongoing bank fraud currently being perpetrated by a senior vice president at a major investment firm. I attached the undeniable digital proof of Preston's crimes. Jada had sent me a text message bragging that she did not need me anymore, proudly declaring that her smart man had fixed everything. She was about to learn a very harsh lesson about the reality of corporate survival. A real woman did not need a finance bro to secure her future. A real woman built her own empire, fortified her own walls, and knew exactly how to decimate anyone arrogant enough to attack her. I looked at the finalized email on my screen. I took one final calm breath and I pressed send. The trap was officially sprung. The absolute destruction of Preston's career, his freedom, and Jada's entire manufactured reality was no longer a possibility. It was an incoming federal certainty. I locked my computer screen, picked up my iced coffee, and walked out of my office to start my workday, leaving them to their spectacular ruin. The Buckhead Grand Country Club was bathed in the warm, golden glow of thousands of suspended crystal chandeliers. Preston and Jada had spared absolutely no expense for Harrison's 70th birthday and legacy gala. They had rented out the entire primary ballroom, a cavernous, historically exclusive space that had once denied our father membership decades ago. Tonight, however, it was filled with towering, excessive arrangements of imported white orchids, an imposing 8-foot ice sculpture carved into the shape of our family crest, and an endless flow of premium vintage champagne. Waitstaff in crisp white tuxedos glided flawlessly across the polished marble floors, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and truffle-infused hors d'oeuvres. It was an absolute masterclass in financial gluttony, and every single glittering cent of it was funded by the massive fraudulent line of credit Preston had illegally secured using my radioactive honeypot data. I stood perfectly still in the shadowed alcove near the heavy velvet drapes of the mezzanine balcony, looking down at the spectacular, fragile illusion they had constructed. I wore a custom-tailored floor-length midnight blue gown that clung to my frame like liquid armor. My hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant twist, and a single string of flawless, understated diamonds rested against my collarbone. I did not look like the defeated, bitter spinster nurse they so desperately wanted me to be. I looked like the executioner. The room below was packed shoulder to shoulder with the absolute upper echelon of Atlanta society. Legacy politicians, prominent appellate judges, chief hospital administrators, and billionaire real estate developers mingled around the massive circular tables. These were the exact same high society gatekeepers Harrison had spent his entire adult life desperately trying to impress. He was seated at the absolute center table in a bespoke velvet tuxedo, his high-tech wheelchair positioned to look like a monarch's throne. He looked deeply satisfied, completely intoxicated by the public adoration, willfully ignorant of the fact that the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission were currently finalizing the operational logistics of their impending raid. Preston was aggressively working the perimeter of the room. He held a heavy crystal tumbler of scotch, laughing far too loudly and firmly shaking hands with city council members. He was sweating profusely, repeatedly wiping his forehead with a silk pocket square. The manic, desperate energy rolling off his body was palpable even from my elevated vantage point. He genuinely thought he had outsmarted the system. He thought the massive influx of untraceable cash he had magically generated had erased Harrison's catastrophic tax debts and permanently secured his own position as the new untouchable family patriarch. He had no idea that his digital fingerprints were currently being categorized as federal evidence. Then there was Jada. She was practically floating across the ballroom in a heavily sequined gold couture dress that screamed for validation. She was in her absolute element, flawlessly playing the role of the devoted, wealthy daughter who had heroically maintained the family's elite status. She caught the eye of the string quartet leader and signaled for the music to stop. The sudden sharp silence rippled through the massive ballroom as she eagerly tapped a silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute. Jada confidently walked up the carpeted steps to the elevated main stage. A spotlight hit her directly, illuminating the excessive diamonds dripping from her ears and wrists. She grabbed the microphone from the chrome stand, flashing a brilliant, perfectly practiced smile at the sea of wealthy, influential guests. She welcomed everyone, her breathy voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. She launched into a deeply theatrical, sickeningly sweet monologue about family legacy, endurance, and the absolute unquestionable greatness of our father. She painted a vivid picture of Harrison as a flawless titan of industry, a man who had selflessly given everything to his community. She conveniently omitted his crippling offshore gambling addictions, his catastrophic federal tax fraud, and the undeniable fact that I had been secretly funding his entire philanthropic reputation for half a decade to keep him out of prison. She spoke eloquently about the terrifying trials our family had faced over the past month, deliberately framing the bank's legitimate foreclosure attempts as some vague, unforeseen tragedy that had severely tested their collective faith. The audience murmured in sympathetic agreement, entirely captivated by her manufactured vulnerability. Then Jada's tone shifted. The syrupy sweetness hardened into a sharp, vindictive edge. She looked directly out at the crowd, her posture stiffening with self-righteous indignation. She told the room that true family was not merely about sharing a bloodline, but about absolute loyalty. She boldly stated that a legacy of this staggering magnitude required fierce protection from those who wished to tear it down out of pure malicious envy. She raised her champagne flute high into the air, the gold sequins of her dress shimmering under the stage lights. "I want to make a very special toast tonight," Jada announced, her voice ringing with unchecked, blinding arrogance. "I want to raise a glass to family members who actually know their place. The ones who deeply understand the meaning of loyalty, rather than the ones who try to destroy us from the inside out of pure spite. We have weathered an incredible storm recently, a terrible storm brought on by betrayal and bitter jealousy. But we survived. And we survived because of one extraordinary man." She gestured grandly toward the center of the room. The lighting technician aggressively swung a secondary spotlight over to illuminate Preston. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his tailored suit jacket and offering a tight, smug nod to the applauding crowd. Jada brought the microphone closer to her lips, her voice dripping with triumphant venom. "I want everyone here tonight to acknowledge my brilliant husband, a real man who stepped up when things got dark, a man who single-handedly saved the family estate from greedy, ungrateful hands. To Preston, the true protector of our legacy." The ballroom erupted into polite, wealthy applause. Glasses clinked cheerfully. Harrison beamed from his wheelchair, proudly raising his own glass toward his son-in-law. It was the ultimate public culmination of their absolute delusion. They had officially declared total victory. I took a single, deliberate step out of the shadows. The lighting technician on the mezzanine balcony noticed my sudden movement. Perhaps it was sheer instinct, or perhaps it was the undeniable suffocating authority radiating from my physical presence, but he immediately adjusted a third spotlight. A brilliant piercing beam of crisp white light hit me squarely, illuminating the rich midnight blue of my gown and the sharp, unyielding angles of my face. The applause in the ballroom below began to falter. The clapping sputtered and died, rolling outward from the back of the room to the front as hundreds of heads turned upward toward the balcony stairs. The sudden, suffocating silence in the room was absolute and entirely deafening. I placed my hand on the polished brass railing and began my descent. My diamond stilettos clicked rhythmically against the marble steps, a slow, steady metronome counting down the final remaining seconds of their fabricated reality. With every step I took, the massive crowd parted. The elite socialites, the politicians, the judges, they all instinctively stepped back, creating a wide, clear path leading directly to the main stage. They could feel the atmospheric pressure in the room completely shift. Preston's arrogant smile vanished instantly. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. His eyes darted wildly toward the exit doors, his primal flight response kicking into overdrive as his subconscious finally realized that I was not a woman who ever retreated. Harrison gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his jaw dropping in stunned, horrified silence. I did not look at either of them. My eyes were locked entirely on Jada. She was completely frozen on the stage, the microphone gripped so tightly in her manicured hand that her knuckles were white. The triumphant, victorious flush on her cheeks had completely evaporated, replaced by a pale, trembling panic. She watched me approach like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. She had fully expected me to be cowering in my apartment, thoroughly humiliated and broken by her text message. She had never anticipated that I would walk directly into the dead center of her glittering, fraudulent kingdom. I reached the base of the stage. I did not rush. I walked up the carpeted steps with the grace and absolute precision of an apex predator making its final approach. I stopped exactly 12 inches from my sister. The sheer physical proximity made her flinch, her shoulders pulling back defensively. She opened her mouth desperately, trying to formulate a sentence, a public reprimand, an order for security to remove me from the premises. But her vocal cords completely failed her. I did not break eye contact. I reached out, my movement smooth, unhurried, and undeniably authoritative. I wrapped my fingers firmly around the sleek metal casing of the microphone. For a fraction of a second, Jada tried to hold on, her eyes wide with mounting terror. I simply raised a single eyebrow, issuing a silent, terrifying warning. She let go. I pulled the microphone smoothly from her trembling hand and turned to face the packed, breathless ballroom. I held the microphone loosely in my hand. The sleek metal casing was still damp and warm from Jada's terrified grip. I did not look at her as she scrambled backward, her gold-sequined heels catching on the carpeted stage until she collided with the heavy velvet drapery. She was entirely trapped in the harsh glare of the spotlight, but my attention had already shifted to the sea of faces below. The absolute elite of Atlanta society, the federal judges, the legacy politicians, the billionaire real estate developers, and the chief hospital administrators stared up at me in breathless silence. These were the people Harrison had spent a lifetime desperately trying to impress, the gatekeepers of the social hierarchy he worshipped. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I brought the microphone to my lips and spoke with a quiet, lethal authority that echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system, forcing every single person in that cavernous ballroom to lean forward just to catch my words. "Good evening," I began, my voice gliding over the crowd like ice water. "My sister speaks with such passionate theatrical conviction about our family legacy. She speaks about protection, about sacrifice, and about the fierce, unyielding bonds of loyalty. She has painted a beautiful, touching portrait of a family unified against the world. But as many of the brilliant legal minds and financial titans in this room already know, a legacy cannot be built on an illusion, and it certainly cannot be sustained by fraud." A murmur rippled through the front tables. Several prominent judges exchanged sharp, calculating glances. I paced slowly across the center of the stage, my midnight blue gown sweeping across the floor. I looked directly down at Preston. He was standing perfectly still next to Harrison's table, the crystal tumbler of scotch shaking violently in his hand. I looked past the crowd, directing my gaze toward the tinted glass of the audiovisual control booth perched high on the mezzanine balcony. Marcus was up there. I gave him a single subtle nod. Instantly, the towering 75-inch LED screens that flanked the main stage, which had spent the entire evening projecting the gaudy gold family crest, went pitch black. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom as the ambient lighting shifted. A heartbeat later, the massive screens flashed back to life with a blinding white background. They were not displaying family photographs. They were displaying high-definition, unredacted legal documents. Jada just offered a very moving toast. I continued, my voice echoing through the stunned silence. She praised her husband for heroically saving the family estate from greedy, ungrateful hands. Let us take a closer look at exactly what Preston saved. I gestured to the massive screens. The first document displayed was a finalized, notarized property deed. I read the critical clauses aloud, translating the dense legal jargon for the few people in the room who did not immediately comprehend what they were looking at. I explained that Harrison's estate, the very property he claimed to have built as his lasting legacy, had been severely leveraged against offshore gambling debts. I explained that the estate had not been saved by Preston. It had been legally seized. I pointed to the glowing text at the bottom of the screens. The deed did not list Harrison as the owner. It did not list Jada or Preston. The sole legal proprietor of the massive family estate was Aegis Elite Care Holding LLC. I own the ground my father sleeps on, I stated flatly, looking directly at Harrison. He is not a patriarch, he is a tenant. And as of this morning, his lease is officially month to month. Harrison gripped the armrests of his high-tech wheelchair. His jaw dropped, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. The wealthy elite surrounding his table instinctively began to physically distance themselves from him, pulling their chairs back, unwilling to be caught in the blast radius of a disgraced bankrupt fraud. But my sister is right about one thing, I said, turning my attention back to the crowd. Preston is indeed a very busy, very proactive man. He has been working tirelessly to secure his own financial future. I looked up at the AV booth. Marcus seamlessly transitioned to the next slide. The screens shifted, projecting a highly confidential document emblazoned with the unmistakable logo of a major national bank. The bold black text across the top read, "Notice of active foreclosure and asset seizure." I looked directly at Jada, who was trembling violently against the stage curtains. While my sister was out purchasing custom couture gowns and renting out country club ballrooms to maintain the illusion of unlimited wealth, I said, my voice dripping with cold precision. Her smart man was failing to pay the mortgage on their luxury Buckhead condo for the last 8 consecutive months. Jada let out a strangled, breathless sob. She covered her face with her hands, completely shattered by the ultimate social execution. The influential socialites she had spent years kissing up to were now actively whispering behind their hands, staring at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. The illusion of her flawless, wealthy marriage was dead laid bare on 50-foot screens for the entire city to witness. But Preston is an investment banker. I continued, stepping right to the edge of the stage and looking directly down into his panicked, sweating face. And a desperate investment banker with his back against the wall will always look for a creative way to generate liquid capital. Which brings us to the true cost of this spectacular birthday gala. Marcus triggered the final sequence. The screens behind me dissolved into lines of complex, raw terminal code. It looked like a foreign language to some, but to the corporate executives, federal investigators, and compliance officers scattered throughout the ballroom, it was instantly recognizable. It was a localized server intrusion log. I walked the audience through the digital forensics with absolute terrifying clarity. I explained that exactly 1 week ago, while standing in the parking lot of Greater Zion Cathedral, Preston used his senior vice president banking credentials to bypass a corporate firewall. I showed the crowd the exact IP address pinging from his mobile device. I showed them the exact timestamps. Preston attempted to breach my medical company's proprietary servers. I announced, my voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating air of the ballroom. He intended to steal a highly confidential database containing the private financial profiles of my high-net-worth clients. He wanted to sell your data to the highest bidder to save himself from total bankruptcy. A wave of genuine outrage swept through the crowd. Several politicians immediately pulled out their phones, furiously texting their aides to sever all ties with Preston's firm. But my cybersecurity team was waiting for him. I continued, my eyes locked on Preston. We routed his intrusion into a digital honeypot. We let him download a decoy database filled with fabricated, legally radioactive financial bait. We gave him millions of dollars in phantom assets. I pointed to the final document on the screen. It was an expedited corporate loan application, fully executed and signed with Preston's digital authorization. And because Preston is the smartest man in the room, I said, my tone laced with absolute mockery, he took those stolen fake medical assets and immediately pledged them as guaranteed collateral to secure a massive corporate bridge loan through his own investment firm. He used those fraudulent funds to pay for the caviar you are eating, the champagne you are drinking, and the ice sculpture melting in the center of this room. Preston dropped his crystal tumbler. The heavy glass shattered against the marble floor, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. He took a stumbling step backward, grabbing his chest, his breath coming in short, erratic gasps. "You didn't save the family estate, Preston," I announced into the microphone, my voice ringing with total, undeniable finality. "You committed a Class C felony on the local Wi-Fi." The entire ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps, outraged whispers, and shocked exclamations. The social elite were practically climbing over each other to distance themselves from Preston and Harrison. No one wanted to be associated with a man actively leveraging fake assets, and absolutely no one wanted to be in the crosshairs of a federal cybercrimes investigation. Harrison clutched his chest, the reality of his absolute ruin finally tearing through his manufactured ego. His velvet tuxedo suddenly looked like a straitjacket. He slumped forward in his wheelchair, his face turning an ashen, sickly gray, as the people he worshipped turned their backs on him in real time. He was a king without a kingdom, a patriarch without a single penny to his name, completely exposed as a parasitic fraud. Preston spun around, his eyes wild and bloodshot, desperately scanning the perimeter of the ballroom for an exit. He was looking for a back door, a service hallway, any possible way to escape the catastrophic destruction of his life. But he was entirely surrounded by the very people he had just attempted to defraud. I stood on the stage, the microphone resting easily in my hand, watching the spectacular total collapse of their empire. I had forwarded the server logs, the IP tracking data, and Preston's fraudulent loan applications directly to my contacts at the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation 48 hours ago. The trap had not just been set, it had already been permanently sealed. Suddenly, the heavy brass-bound oak doors at the very back of the ballroom violently swung open. The heavy oak doors hit the adjacent walls with a thunderous crash. 4 men stepped into the golden chandelier-lit ballroom. 2 of them wore dark tailored suits with unmistakable federal windbreakers layered over top, the bold yellow letters FBI gleaming under the country club lighting. They were flanked by 2 uniformed Atlanta police officers, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. The collective silence in the room deepened into a suffocating vacuum. The city elite, the judges, the legacy politicians, they all instinctively pressed themselves against the linen-draped tables, creating a wide, unobstructed runway down the center of the marble floor. The lead federal agent did not hesitate. His eyes scanned the room with clinical precision before locking directly onto Preston. He marched forward, his heavy boots thudding rhythmically against the polished stone. Preston looked like a man who had just watched his own executioner approach. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the spilled scotch he had dropped moments prior. He raised his hands in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to summon the arrogant, untouchable finance bro persona he had weaponized for a decade. He tried to puff out his chest. He tried to speak with the authority of a man who managed billions in assets, but no sound came out. The absolute reality of federal prison had entirely paralyzed his vocal cords. Preston Vance, the lead agent, announced, his voice carrying the hardened, unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and corporate espionage. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Preston did not move. His eyes darted wildly toward the exit, toward the wealthy investors he had schmoozed all evening, and finally toward Harrison. But no one stepped forward. No billionaire benefactor rose to his defense. No judge offered a legal objection. He was entirely isolated in his guilt. The two uniformed officers stepped around the agent, grabbing Preston by the shoulders and forcefully spinning him around. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the cavernous ballroom. The sound was sharp, definitive, and absolutely permanent. The man who had mocked my intelligence, who had laughed at my nursing career, who had proudly boasted that a real woman needed a man like him for financial security, was now being physically restrained and read his Miranda rights in front of 500 of Atlanta's most powerful citizens. The spell over the stage suddenly broke. Jada let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She scrambled down the carpeted stairs of the stage, tripping over the hem of her heavily sequined gold couture gown. She hit the marble floor hard, scrambling to her feet and lunging toward the federal agents. "You cannot take him!" Jada screamed, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated panic. "He is a senior vice president. He is a Vance. You are making a mistake. He was just fixing the accounts." "Ma'am, step back immediately," the second federal agent warned, stepping directly into her path and holding up a firm hand. Jada recoiled, her carefully constructed, flawless aesthetic completely disintegrating. Dark streaks of expensive mascara ran in jagged lines down her pale cheeks. Her perfectly styled hair was coming undone, falling in chaotic strands across her face. She spun around, her wild eyes landing directly on me. She lunged forward and grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. It was the exact same entitled grip she used to use when we were teenagers, grabbing my arm to demand I take the blame for breaking our mother's expensive vases so she could keep her golden child status. But we were not teenagers anymore, and she was not asking me to cover up a broken vase. She was demanding I fix a multi-million-dollar federal felony. "Fix this!" Jada shrieked, shaking my arm frantically. "You did this. You set him up. Tell them you authorized the transfer. Tell them it was a corporate merger. You have to stop them from taking him." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, and then I looked directly into her frantic, tear-filled eyes. I did not move. I did not yell back. My voice was dangerously calm. "I am not your shield anymore, Jada," I stated flatly. "I am not quietly paying your debts in the shadows while you parade around in designer gowns bought with stolen money. Your smart man broke federal law on a public network. There is no fixing this." "You have the money," Jada screamed, completely oblivious to the hundreds of powerful guests watching her spectacular meltdown. "You just bought a $5 million medical facility. You have the liquid capital. Transfer the funds right now. Pay his bail. Pay the IRS. Just pay them off like you paid off Dad's gambling debts." A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. Jada had been so blinded by her own panicked entitlement that she had just publicly confessed to knowing about Harrison's catastrophic gambling debts, and the fact that I had been secretly funding their lifestyle. The elite society gatekeepers she had spent years desperately trying to impress were now looking at her with absolute, unfiltered revulsion. She had just destroyed the very last shred of the family's social standing in a single hysterical breath. Before Jada could continue her frantic demands, the sharp whir of an electric motor cut through the tension. Harrison rolled his high-tech wheelchair forward, his face a mottled, dangerous shade of purple. He pushed his way through the stunned crowd, stopping just inches from where I stood. He did not look at Jada. He did not look at the federal agents actively marching his son-in-law toward the exit doors. He looked directly at me, his eyes burning with the furious, entitled rage of a patriarch who was watching his kingdom burn to ash. "Call your corporate lawyers immediately!" Harrison barked, his voice straining with desperation. "Aegis Elite. CARE has an entire legal department on retainer. I know what you pay those fixers. Get them down to the federal courthouse. Right this second." You will provide Preston with full legal representation, and you will have this entire misunderstanding swept under the rug before the morning news cycle. I stared at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel small. The man who had happily accepted my money while telling his country club friends that my career was a cute little hobby. Even now, watching his legacy actively collapse under the weight of his own greed, he still believed he had the absolute right to command my resources. He still believed my empire existed solely to protect his fragile ego. "Think of our reputation," Harrison demanded, slamming his fist against the armrest of his wheelchair when I did not immediately reach for my phone. "You are destroying the family name. Do you have any idea what these people will think of us? You are embarrassing me in front of the entire diocese. You will fix this right now." I slowly pulled my arm out of Jada's desperate grip. I smoothed the sleeve of my midnight blue gown, my movements deliberate and entirely unbothered. "My corporate lawyers work exclusively for my company," I replied, my voice carrying clearly over the dead silence of the ballroom. "They protect my assets, my clients, and my legacy. They do not work for the men who try to steal from me. And as for your reputation, Harrison, I highly suggest you take a good look around this room." Harrison's head snapped up. He looked at the faces of the judges, the politicians, and the billionaires he worshipped. They were already turning their backs on him. They were gathering their coats, whispering to their spouses, and actively walking toward the exits. No one wanted to be caught in the background of a photograph when the press inevitably arrived. The glorious 70th birthday gala had transformed into a social plague, and Harrison was the infectious center. "The family name is already dead," I told him, offering a cold final smile. "You killed it the moment you decided my hard work was nothing more than a bank account for your gambling debts. Preston just buried it." The federal agents reached the heavy oak doors, physically dragging a sobbing, completely broken Preston out into the humid Atlanta night. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the country club foyer, casting harsh shadows across the polished marble. Jada collapsed onto the floor, burying her face in her hands, her hysterical sobs echoing through the emptying ballroom. Harrison slumped back in his wheelchair, his chest heaving, his hands trembling violently as he stared at the massive screens that still displayed the undeniable proof of his total ruin. I looked down at them, the people who treated me like dirt for 8 long years. I looked down at them, the people who had treated me like dirt for 8 long years. The cavernous ballroom of the Buckhead Grand Country Club, which just an hour ago had been buzzing with the arrogant laughter of Atlanta's most elite socialites, was now a hollow, echoing tomb. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the hall had swung shut behind the federal agents, but the harsh, strobing glare of the red and blue police lights still pierced through the massive stained glass windows. The flashing colors washed over the extravagant floral arrangements and the melting ice sculpture, casting long, jagged shadows across the polished marble floor. Jada remained crumpled at the base of the stage. Her gold-sequined couture gown, purchased with stolen funds to ensure she was the absolute center of attention, was now tangled around her knees. She was shaking violently, her breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps, as she stared at the empty space where her husband had been standing just moments before. Harrison sat paralyzed in his high-tech wheelchair. His hands gripped the armrest so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. His chest heaved beneath his bespoke velvet tuxedo, his eyes fixed blindly on the glowing 75-inch screens that still broadcasted his financial ruin to the empty room. The few remaining guests, the country club staff and the catering crew, stood perfectly still against the perimeter walls. They were watching a dynasty actively burn to the ground, entirely captivated by the spectacular destruction of the Vance family name. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the familiar, suffocating grip of familial obligation that had dictated my entire adult life. I felt nothing but absolute crystal-clear liberation. I tossed the microphone onto the carpeted stage. The sharp thud echoed loudly, causing Jada to flinch. I slowly walked down the short flight of stairs, my diamond stilettos clicking with deliberate precision against the floor. I stopped directly between my sobbing sister and my broken father. Jada looked up at me. Her face was unrecognizable. The flawless, manufactured confidence she had worn like armor her entire life had completely dissolved. Dark mascara stained her cheeks and her perfectly styled hair hung in chaotic strands across her face. She reached out with a trembling hand, her manicured fingers hovering just inches from the hem of my midnight blue gown. "Kendra, please." Jada choked out her voice, barely a whisper. "You cannot leave us like this. You have to help him. You have the money. You can hire the best defense attorneys in the state. We are family. You cannot just turn your back on your own blood." I looked down at her outstretched hand. I did not step away, but I did not reach out to comfort her. "I am not your shield anymore," I declared, my voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "I am not your ATM, and I am certainly not your scapegoat." Jada let out a pathetic whimper, pulling her hand back to her chest. "For nearly a decade, I allowed you to play the role of the golden child." I continued, my tone entirely devoid of warmth. "I stayed in the shadows. I worked 80-hour weeks building my company from the ground up while you maxed out credit cards and mocked my ambition. You built your entire identity on the delusion that you were inherently better than me because you married a man in a tailored suit. You spent years telling everyone who would listen that I was a bitter, jealous spinster who lacked the basic social skills to secure a wealthy husband. You relied on my silence to maintain your perfect illusion, but your illusion was funded by fraud Jada, and my silence has officially expired." I turned my back on her and took 2 slow steps toward Harrison. My father did not look up. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle feathered in his cheek. The arrogant, imposing titan of industry who had commanded rooms and intimidated rivals for 40 years was entirely gone. He was just an old, bankrupt man trapped in a wheelchair facing the catastrophic consequences of his own insatiable greed. "Look at me," I commanded. Harrison slowly lifted his head. The raw, unfiltered hatred burning in his eyes was palpable, but it was entirely overshadowed by his profound realization of defeat. He hated me because I had won. He hated me because I had exposed him. But mostly he hated me because he knew I was absolutely right. "You think this makes you powerful?" Harrison spat, his voice a raspy, bitter whisper. "You think destroying your own family makes you a success. You are nothing but a vindictive, ungrateful child who got lucky." I smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that held absolutely no joy. "I did not get lucky, Harrison. I got smart," I replied smoothly. "But you would not know anything about that, would you? You spent your entire life playing high-stakes games with money that did not belong to you. You gambled away the family estate, you leveraged your own daughter's future, and you relied on a parasitic investment banker to hide your federal crimes. You thought you were untouchable. You thought you could simply take what I had built and use it to cover your tracks." I leaned down, placing my hands on the armrests of his wheelchair so that my face was mere inches from his. I forced him to hold my gaze. "I want you to think back to a very specific Tuesday afternoon 8 years ago," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. I was 26 years old. I had just finalized the business plan for Aegis Elite Care. I had spent 6 months researching the market, securing preliminary vendor contracts, and running the financial projections. I walked into your oak-paneled study, and I asked you for a $75,000 seed loan. It was a fraction of what you routinely dropped on a single weekend in Atlantic City. Harrison's eyes flickered. He remembered. "You did not even open the binder." I continued, my words hitting him like physical blows. "You looked at the cover, you laughed in my face, and you slid it right back across your mahogany desk. You told me that nursing was a service job for people who lacked real ambition. You told me I did not have the killer instinct required to build a corporate empire. You told me I was wasting your valuable time." I stood up straight, smoothing the front of my gown. And then I said, making sure my voice carried to the few remaining country club staff watching from the shadows, "You pulled out your checkbook. But you did not write a check for my business. You wrote a $50,000 check to Jada so she could spend the summer backpacking through Europe with her sorority sisters." Harrison swallowed hard, the skin around his eyes sagging. "Do you remember the exact words you used when you denied my loan?" Harrison, I asked, tilting my head slightly. He remained completely silent, his chest rising and falling with shallow, rapid breaths. You looked me dead in the eyes and you said real success requires anticipating obstacles. I recited perfectly mimicking his arrogant, condescending tone from a decade ago. You told me that if I could not secure my own capital, I had already failed the first test of business. You told me I was a liability. I took a deliberate step back, encompassing the entirety of the ruined ballroom with a wide sweep of my hand. I gestured to the shattered crystal glass on the floor, the abandoned caviar stations, and the massive screens still displaying his federal foreclosure notices. You should have anticipated me, I stated, delivering the ultimate undeniable checkmate. I anticipated your gambling debts. I anticipated your catastrophic tax fraud. I anticipated that you would eventually run out of offshore accounts and turn to Preston for a fraudulent bailout. And I certainly anticipated that Preston was arrogant and stupid enough to try and steal from my proprietary servers to save your miserable skin. I did not destroy this family, Harrison. I simply stopped paying the ransom to keep the illusion alive. I let you destroy yourselves. Harrison closed his eyes, a single tear of pure humiliated defeat escaping and tracking down his weathered cheek. He had absolutely nothing left to say. There were no more threats to issue, no more corporate lawyers to summon, no more grand legacies to protect. He was entirely, fundamentally broken. I turned away from my father and my sister. I did not look at them again. I had spent 34 years begging for their approval, twisting myself into knots, trying to earn a place at their table. I had exhausted my emotional reserves, attempting to prove my worth to people who were fundamentally incapable of recognizing it. The overwhelming need for their validation had kept me chained to their toxic, parasitic orbit for my entire adult life. But those chains were officially severed. The debt was paid in full, and the accounts were permanently closed. I turned on my heel, the heavy silk of my midnight blue gown swirling around my ankles. I walked away from the stage, heading straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. I walked past the abandoned tables, past the wilting white orchids, and past the towering ice sculpture of a family crest that no longer held any power over me. I pushed through the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom and stepped out into the humid electric air of the Atlanta night. The flashing red and blue lights of the remaining police cruisers strobed across the country club parking lot, painting the manicured landscaping in brilliant, chaotic colors. I walked down the concrete steps, my head held high, the flashing lights illuminating my path to freedom. 6 months is a remarkably short amount of time for an entire dynasty to turn to dust, but federal prosecutors move with astonishing speed when the evidence is handed to them on a silver platter. Preston did not get the comfortable white-collar country club prison experience he had likely envisioned for himself. The digital trail he left on my honeypot servers was so comprehensively damning, so irrefutably clear, that his high-priced defense attorney advised him to take a plea deal before the trial even officially began. He pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and corporate espionage. The presiding judge, who happened to be one of the very men who had attended Harrison's disastrous gala, did not show a single ounce of leniency. Preston was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. His smug, untouchable banker persona was permanently traded for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit and a meticulously scheduled routine dictated by prison guards. There were no silk pocket squares in cell block D, and there was no negotiating with the warden. With Preston securely locked away and his fraudulent bridge loan completely dissolved by the federal government, the financial dam broke. Harrison and Jada had been so blinded by their desperate, arrogant need to secure the family estate and permanently freeze me out of the picture that they had blindly signed the transfer documents Preston had eagerly put in front of them. They had officially legally accepted the transition of the estate, but in doing so, they also legally inherited the toxic liabilities attached to it. The moment Preston's untraceable cash evaporated into federal evidence, Harrison and Jada were left holding the bag on an $800,000 mountain of debt. It was a suffocating, insurmountable combination of unpaid property taxes, defaulted medical liabilities, and federal penalties that Preston had tried to digitally erase. Aegis Elite Care Holding LLC officially moved forward with the eviction. I did not attend the proceedings. I did not need to. My corporate attorneys handled the logistics with ruthless surgical efficiency. County sheriffs arrived at the massive wrought iron gates of the Buckhead estate on a rainy Tuesday morning. They gave Harrison and Jada exactly 2 hours to pack whatever personal belongings they could fit into a single moving van before permanently changing the locks. Jada had wept on the front lawn, clutching a single designer handbag, screaming at the officers that there had been a mistake. Harrison had sat in his wheelchair in the pouring rain, watching the massive mahogany doors of his kingdom slam shut forever. Their new reality was the brutal, uncompromising wake-up call. Without my secret financial bailouts, without Preston's banking salary, and with their credit scores completely annihilated, they were forced into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the far industrial outskirts of the city. The contrast was almost poetic. Instead of imported marble floors, suspended crystal chandeliers, and vaulted ceilings, they now lived with peeling linoleum, water-stained popcorn ceilings, and the constant rattling hum of a failing window air conditioning unit. The walls were paper-thin, offering absolutely no buffer from the arguments of their neighbors or the blaring sirens of passing emergency vehicles. Harrison's high-tech wheelchair barely fit through the narrow apartment doorways. The imposing patriarch who had once demanded the absolute center table at elite galas was now confined to a dingy, dimly lit living room, staring blankly at a small television screen. His pristine high society image was permanently destroyed. His former friends, the legacy politicians and billionaire real estate developers, had completely blacklisted him. His name, once a symbol of untouchable wealth and influence, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered over expensive scotch at the very country clubs that had permanently revoked his membership. He was a ghost, a disgraced pariah who had bet his entire legacy on a losing hand and lost everything. But perhaps the most exquisite irony of all belonged to Jada. The crushing reality of their $800,000 debt meant that performing the role of a devastated, misunderstood socialite was no longer a viable career path. She had to pay rent. She had to buy groceries. She had to get a job. With no college degree, no practical skills, and a reputation entirely ruined by her public meltdown at the gala, her options were practically non-existent. She was forced to take a minimum-wage retail position at an upscale boutique in a luxury shopping district. It was the exact same boutique where she used to spend thousands of dollars of my money on a single Tuesday afternoon. Now she spent 8 hours a day standing on her aching feet, wearing a stiff polyester uniform, steaming, and folding the very designer clothes she used to flaunt on social media. She had to smile and offer polite, subservient greetings to the wealthy women who used to attend her dinner parties. Her former friends would casually stroll into the boutique, dripping in diamonds and carrying expensive leather handbags. Some of them would look right through her, treating her with the exact same dismissive, invisible condescension she had always reserved for the working class. Others would recognize her, offer a tight, pitying smile, and loudly ask for a different sales associate to assist them. They would make her fetch different shoe sizes from the stockroom, complaining about her slow service while she bit her tongue and apologized. Every single shift was an agonizing, prolonged death of her ego. She was finally living the reality she had always mocked, entirely dependent on the grace of the very people she used to view as beneath her. As for me, my life had never been quieter or more fulfilling. I was sitting in my corner office at Aegis Elite Care, reviewing the architectural blueprints for a new state-of-the-art pediatric wing. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm, golden glow across my mahogany desk. My business was thriving, my investments were secure, and my mind was entirely clear. I had successfully excised the rot from my life, and the space they left behind was filled with genuine peace. I was no longer the awkward scapegoat carrying the weight of my family's delusions. I was exactly who I had built myself to be. My personal cell phone buzzed against the polished wood of my desk. I glanced at the screen. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. I let it go to voicemail, my eyes never leaving the blueprints in front of me. I traced a line across the proposed lobby layout, making a mental note to expand the natural lighting. A minute later, a notification chimed indicating a new audio message. I picked up the phone, tapped the screen, and placed it on speaker. A heavy, ragged sigh echoed through the quiet office, followed by the unmistakable sound of a passing police siren and the dull roar of highway traffic in the background. It was Harrison. Kendra, his voice rasped. It sounded thin, fragile, and utterly defeated. The commanding, arrogant baritone of the patriarch was completely gone, replaced by the trembling vibration of an old, broken man. I know you probably do not want to hear from me. I know I have no right to ask you for anything. But things are so bad here. Jada is struggling. The debt collectors are calling every hour. We have absolutely nothing left. I was a fool, Kendra. I was blinded by my own pride, and I was entirely wrong about you. You are brilliant. You always were. Please just give me a chance to explain. Give your father one more chance to make this right. I need your help. We need your forgiveness. He drew a shaky breath, preparing to launch into another manufactured, desperate monologue about family bloodlines and redemption. I sat back in my leather chair and listened to the silence of my own office. I did not feel a spike of anger. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindication or the urge to argue with his pathetic apologies. I felt absolutely nothing at all. The invisible thread that had kept me tied to his approval had been permanently severed. I reached out and tapped the red icon on the screen. The voicemail cut off, instantly silencing his desperate pleas mid-sentence. I hit delete. I slid the phone face down on the desk, picked up my pen, and went back to work. The Atlantic breeze carried the sharp, clean scent of salt and seagrass sweeping across the expansive teak deck of my newly purchased beachfront property. The house was a modern architectural marvel of glass and weathered cedar perched high on the pristine dunes of Kiowa Island. It was an $8 million sanctuary, completely paid for in cash, and the deed bore only my name. There were no hidden clauses, no leveraged offshore accounts, and absolutely no predatory liens. It was built entirely on a foundation of legitimate, hard-earned success. I leaned against the heavy glass railing, holding a slender flute of vintage champagne. Below me, the ocean churned in a rhythmic, soothing cadence, the crashing waves glowing a deep, bruised purple under the fading light of the sunset. This open-breathing horizon was the exact opposite of the suffocating, windowless mahogany study where Harrison had once dismissed my ambitions. The air here was light. It did not carry the suffocating pressure of manufactured social hierarchies, the exhausting demands of toxic family loyalty, or the constant underlying threat of financial ruin. Behind me, the massive sliding glass doors were pushed wide open, blending the cool ocean breeze with the warm, vibrant energy of a real celebration. My house was filled with people, but there were no legacy politicians or desperate social climbing billionaires trying to impress each other with fabricated wealth. I was surrounded by my chosen family. Marcus, my lead cybersecurity director, the man who had flawlessly engineered the digital honeypot that permanently dismantled Preston's banking career, was standing by the outdoor fire pit. He was laughing loudly, gesturing with a skewer of grilled seafood as he told a story to a small group of my executive board members. Beside him stood Dr. Eris Thorne, the brilliant chief of pediatrics, who had partnered with me to design Aegis Elite Care's newest hospital wing. These were my loyal friends, my supportive colleagues, and my trusted business partners. They were a circle of fiercely intelligent individuals who actually valued my brilliance. They did not require me to shrink my personality or minimize my accomplishments to make them feel comfortable. When I spoke, they listened. When I presented a strategic vision, they challenged it with respect and helped me build it into reality. They celebrated my relentless drive instead of categorizing it as an arrogant threat. Dr. Thorne caught my eye across the deck and raised her glass in a silent, respectful toast. I returned the gesture, a genuine, unburdened smile breaking across my face. I remembered the day I first brought Eris into my office, proposing a radical, highly expensive restructuring of our outpatient care model. Harrison had always taught me that spending capital on comprehensive patient comfort was a naive waste of profit margins. He had drilled it into my head that medical care was a commodity meant to be ruthlessly exploited for the benefit of the shareholders. But Eris had looked at my proposal, her eyes lighting up with shared passion, and told me it was the most visionary medical model she had ever seen. She saw my worth instantly. She recognized my competence immediately, entirely bypassing the rigid, misogynistic gatekeeping that my father had always tried to enforce. I took a slow sip of the cold, crisp champagne. Just hours ago, sitting in my Atlanta office, I had pressed delete on Harrison's desperate, trembling voicemail. That single, effortless action had severed the final fraying string that tethered me to my past. For 34 years, I had operated under the devastating delusion that love was a transactional currency, something I had to actively purchase through blind obedience and secret financial bailouts. I had believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved my undeniable value to the family estate, my mother, my father, and my sister would finally see me as an equal. But blood does not automatically grant someone the right to your soul. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary, not a hostile hostage situation. Harrison and Jada had spent their entire lives treating me like a disposable asset, a convenient, socially awkward scapegoat they could loudly mock in public and silently drain in private. They had demanded absolute loyalty while simultaneously bleeding my corporate accounts dry to fund their extravagant, fraudulent illusions. For years, my phone ringing had been a source of primal anxiety. Every notification had carried the potential for another crisis. It was always Jada demanding a wire transfer to cover a luxury vacation she could not afford, or Harrison summoning me to his mahogany study, just to remind me that my medical company was nothing compared to his investment portfolio. I used to physically brace myself before opening a text message, my muscles coiled tight, preparing for the inevitable insult or the frantic demand for cash. Now my phone was just a tool for my business. It was silent unless I chose to answer it. The sheer physical relief of that silence was staggering. I had surgically excised the tumor of their entitlement from my life, and the recovery was glorious. I watched the horizon darken, the first brilliant stars piercing through the deep indigo twilight. The revenge I had exacted upon them was spectacular, complete, and entirely public. I had stripped Harrison of his patriarchal crown and exposed him to the high society elite as a penniless, parasitic fraud. I had allowed Preston's arrogant greed to march him directly into a federal penitentiary where his Ivy League degree meant absolutely nothing. I had forced Jada out of her custom couture gowns and into a minimum wage uniform, forcing her to fold the very designer clothes she used to flaunt as weapons of social superiority. But standing here enveloped by the rich laughter of my true friends and the steady roar of the ocean, I realized a profound truth. The revenge was merely a necessary byproduct of my survival. Taking their money, liquidating their fraudulent assets, and obliterating their unearned pride had been deeply satisfying, but it was not the ultimate prize. The true victory was the profound, quiet peace that had finally settled into my bones. It was the realization that I no longer had to anticipate their betrayals or aggressively manage their manufactured crises. I no longer had to wake up wondering how to protect my corporate empire from the very people who shared my DNA. I had spent so long fighting their battles and covering their tracks that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist for myself. My revenge was not just about destroying their glittering, fraudulent kingdom. It was about reclaiming my own undeniable worth. I had walked directly into the fire of their manipulation and emerged forged in steel. I had built a lasting legacy based on integrity, operational intelligence, and relentless hard work. The staggering wealth I commanded, the expansive properties I owned, and the deep respect I commanded in the medical and corporate sectors were not inherited from a corrupt patriarch. They were earned through my own grit. Every single brick of my empire belonged solely to me, and absolutely no one would ever be allowed to leverage it again. Marcus walked over to the glass railing carrying a fresh, chilled bottle of champagne. He smoothly topped off my glass, giving me a knowing, fiercely supportive look before clapping me on the shoulder and heading back to the warmth of the fire pit. He did not need to ask if I was okay. He did not need to offer empty platitudes or unsolicited advice. He already knew the answer. The ocean breeze picked up heavily, rustling the seagrass along the dunes and carrying the sharp scent of the tide over the deck. The magnificent house behind me radiated warmth, filled with the steady, comforting hum of people who loved me for exactly who I was. I turned my back to the lively party and faced the dark, endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. I raised my glass high into the cool night air, offering a silent, triumphant toast to the crashing waves. I am at peace, completely and unapologetically free from the toxic weight of a family that never deserved me. True family is not determined by bloodline or obligation. It is built on a foundation of mutual respect, unwavering support, and genuine appreciation for who you are. The most powerful revenge against toxic individuals is not found in their destruction, but in your own relentless success and absolute peace. When you stop seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you reclaim your own power. You learn that walking away is not a failure, but a profound act of self-preservation. Your worth is inherent, and you alone hold the pen to write your final chapter. If you have ever found the courage to walk away from toxic family dynamics to build your own beautiful reality, share your journey in the comments below and subscribe for more stories of triumphant resilience.